As I mentioned earlier, our world feels like it's on fire right now, and we are desperately trying to smother the flames. But should we be? As I sit and reflect on the realities and events that have occurred over the last several weeks and months, I start to wonder whether it might be more appropriate to fan the blazes, let everything burn to ash, and seek to find a phoenix from the flames. What if we were able to start afresh, to let go of all of the practices and problems that have led us to this moment in life? Burn down our healthcare systems, our seniors' care, our broken economic structures that allow for the massive divide between the rich and the poor that continues to grow. Burn down the systems of oppression, the structures that imprison people of color at higher rates than white people, the structures that hold white, hetero, cisgendered, upper middle class men at the center, and push everyone else to the edges of society. Burn it all down and build up something beautiful, inclusive, diverse, and intersectional in its place. And yet, as much as I love the idea of getting a do-over, I am called to act for love and justice in this world. I am called to create the world of love and compassion that I know is possible and that I can feel in the marrow of my bones and in the depths of my soul as real. And the truth, true and better than we could ever imagine. And to be honest, a do-over sounds too much like heaven to me, something that will be given to me once I have lived through this purgatory. Although burning it down and starting over is a utopia that I often dream about, I am called to live in this world. I struggled a lot with trying to correlate the terrors of this week into some sort of convenient, comfortable, sermon-sized packet for you all. But I have to admit that my emotions are too big right now. Too much conflict and discourse, too many pressing news stories and opinion pieces, police brutality, violence against people of color and Indigenous people, the number of fatal opioid overdoses in the month of May has hit record highs. So many other things that I can hardly keep track of everything. If you were to look at my browser history over the last week, you would see the following titles. 7 disruptive church trends every leader should be watching out for. Navigating pastoral grief during COVID-19. Whiteness can't save us. How to fight racism with inner work. Widening the circle of concern. Canadians on Pride in the pandemic. What began as a protest continues to be a protest. Not to mention the dozens of news articles, both from CBC and CNN. And yet, even though this seems like an amorphous collection of disconnected articles, I'm hoping to pull it together into something that stirs your spirits and has you thinking differently by this afternoon. And I will even relate it back to the theme of our month, compassion. I resonate a lot with Mulan, the young child in our story this morning, not in connection with their gender spaciousness, or their eccentric fashion and accessorizing. I resonate with their original reactions to the pressures of their peers, the pressures of society. So often when expressing myself or imagining the reactions of my wishes to express myself, I receive shame and guilt. Stop sharing. You are too much. Maybe this is something that I learned as a child in my family life, or maybe as a teenager in the public school system of Southern Alberta, or it definitely was part of my relationship and marriage as a young 20-year-old. You are too much, too bold, too political, too optimistic, too idealistic. Going out into the world with feathers and wings and sparkles and fishtails, sharing all of our fabulous diversity with the world, only to be teased and taunted. And then going out in the world with a turtle shell and spikes will get much the same response. Why are you so bitter? Stop focusing on the negative. You should smile more. How is it that we are supposed to create the world of love and justice, diversity and inclusion in a world that is constantly where the constant response to our actions is too much? Do you really need to talk about everything? Can't you just narrow down your sermon to one topic? Sharing all of these ideas is going to be confusing. Too many rules and restrictions from provincial health regulations. Too long to be separated and made to stay apart. Too many rainbows. Too much pride. Too much education for our young ones. They don't need to know about that yet. Too much racial tension. Too much protesting. Too much riots. Too many things to pay attention to. Too many issues to focus on. And yet, here we are. And here we have always been. Marginal voices fighting to be heard, rioting to be seen, speaking up for change. March 1965. 3 marches from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama took place, organized to demonstrate the desires of African American citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote. The initial march on Sunday, March the 7th, ended with state troopers attacking marchers with billy clubs and tear gas. The second march ended in the murder of a white civil rights activist and minister. Finally, at the third march, organizers and marchers were protected from the state police by the National Guard. The National Guard needed to protect African Americans from the state police. It took them 4 days to walk 54 miles from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the state capital, where they were able to register to vote. The police brutality on that first march, Sunday the 7th, has become known as Bloody Sunday. June 1969, police raid gay bars in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, New York. The police separate everyone, taking men outside and asking them for identification and forcing everyone who is dressed as a woman into the bathrooms where they are asked, no, ordered to prove their gender to a police officer. This violence has been going on for years and decades in some United States cities. But on that night in June 1969, at the Stonewall Inn gay bar, after years of humiliation and police brutality, people fought against the police. The Stonewall Riots were not a well-organized event. They began and continued that week out of necessity, a necessity to be heard and to be witnessed by the general public. February 1981, Operation Soap was launched. Metropolitan Toronto Police simultaneously raided 4 gay bathhouses in Toronto. These raids and their aftermath are today widely considered to be Canada's equivalent to the Stonewall Riots. On that night, Toronto police arrested 20 owners of bawdy houses or brothels, and nearly 300 men who were patrons. Thousands of protesters flooded the streets in the next several weeks as police officers continued to arrest bathhouse owners and their patrons. The laws that allowed the police to make these charges and arrests were not repealed in Canadian courts until 2019. The Oka crisis in the summer of 1990 is another example of police brutality here in Canada. Although there is a very long history of conflict between Indigenous peoples in Canada and Canadian authorities, a history that leads up to this very day, the crisis in Oka, Quebec, over the lands of the Kanesatake Reserve was the first well-publicized violent conflict between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. Over the span of 78 days, there was a standoff between Mohawk warriors and activists and the Canadian Armed Forces, RCMP officers, and Quebec Provincial Police. More than 100 people were wounded during those 78 days, and 1 person died. The histories of the minorities and marginalized peoples in both the United States and Canada are similar. Protesting has long been a practice used to force people in power to change the systems of oppression in both countries, as it is around the world. "Let them eat cake" is a quote that's often attributed to Marie Antoinette in the middle of protests occurring in the 18th century France during a famine. This is not a new thing. The ability to protest is a fundamental right to the freedom of expression. It is a lawful act in Canada and part of the First Amendment in the United States. Often, however, nonviolent protests end up turning into riots when police interference has begun. And we have seen the truth of this many times over in recent news, as well as in the samples that I have highlighted here. How do we come to terms with this idea of rioting and protesting and seeking to have expression? Oppressors treat us like children in our storybook on that 3rd day at school. How do we have them instead treat us with the curiosity, joy, and even adoration that we witness later on? Moving away from the ideas of protesting as being too much, too many, and too long or too confusing, and moving towards an understanding of acceptance and solidarity. I am speaking here with the challenge of getting my nouns accurate, because I have been on both sides of this equation. I have been in the marginalized group as a woman, as a queer individual, as a young professional. I have been seen as less than and with a lack of knowledge, a lack of experience. a lack of true identity. And I have been the oppressor, a white woman walking in the streets of downtown Calgary, Toronto, Kelowna, living in fear for no reason. A white person growing up with an understanding, or maybe not an understanding, of my racial supremacy. I am middle class and highly educated. I have walked both sides of this divide, as I'm sure many of you have too. But there is still work to be done for all of us. And this is where I think compassion can come in. Both compassion for our fellow human beings and compassion for ourselves. Being able to sit with our discomfort, like I talked about last week, and allow ourselves to be okay with that discomfort, to help us to understand where our privilege lies. It can also help us understand how to witness the struggle that others are going through. Although allowing us to empathize with people who are in conflict, who are protesting the systems that offer us safety and comfort. Through practices of mindfulness, meditation, and compassion, we can help to cultivate a sense of belonging and community for those whose experiences are different than our own. We can do this with the people who have different opinions about gathering in person at this time in our society. Sitting with our own understanding of expanding our personal bubble, allowing ourselves to understand the reasons and opinions that have led us to our decisions, can help us understand the reasons that someone might come up with different conclusions. The same is true for racial justice and for LGBTQ injustice. Settling into a practice where we examine our thoughts, feelings, and reactions to events around us will end up challenging our behaviors. It will let us sit with the cultural conditioning that we have experienced our entire lives and let us begin to untrain some of those behaviors. Finding compassion while the world is on fire might be a practice that we can take up in support of those who are protesting in the streets and those who are being pushed and taking steps towards rioting. Finding compassion while the world is shifting towards a moral higher ground is needed. Protesting happens in many forms: marching through the streets, writing letters to politicians, educating ourselves and others, making art, both visual and written. Maybe it is time that we add mindfulness, meditation, and compassion seeking onto this list of protests. May we make it so.